The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, and it's great to be with you at the beginning of another extensive orchestration study on yet another great, groundbreaking piece of music. We're starting with the first movement of Schoenberg's 5 pieces for orchestra. There's sometimes a sense that this music is sort of arbitrary, or the construction is just quite different, and it just seems to be a jumble the first time that you listen to it. And that has to do with just unfamiliarity, I think, with where Schoenberg is coming from in this particular approach. But if you listen to it closely, you'll start to notice that he does develop his themes, and it really is as much of a exploration of timbre and tone quality and mixing of instruments and relationships as it is functional development like we would see in a symphony. We have to remember that when this piece came along, there was no Rite of Spring, there was no planets, and Debussy's La Mer had just been written. So this would have come straight out of left field for its listeners. And yet, thanks to certain champions of Schoenberg and his works, it was eventually heard in London and in other places. And the sort of radical principles that Schoenberg puts forth here of total chromaticism, not atonality, he really disliked that term. He saw this as an extension of explorations that he was already playing with in his earlier, more tonal works. So let's just get straight to analyzing the orchestration on this first page after we look at the instrumentation. And as I discussed in the intro to this particular series, the orchestra is quite a bit scaled down from the one that was in the 1909 version. Once again, reminding you that we will be analyzing the revision, which I feel is perhaps less huge but more calculated and perhaps better balanced. We've got our 2 flutes, 2 piccolos, so 4 flutes total, 3 oboes, 3 oboe family members, 2 oboes and English horn, and 4 clarinet family members, E-flat clarinet on top, clarinets in A below, and bass clarinet in B-flat on the bottom. 3 bassoon family members, bassoons 1 and 2 plus contra. Then basically just 4-3-3-1 brass here. Xylophone, timpani, general percussion. It's kind of interesting that this publisher sees fit to put the tuned percussion on top of the timpani. Harp, celesta, and then our string section. So we can see that even though this is a pretty good-sized orchestra, with 4-3-4-3 winds and the full brass section, it isn't enormous and sprawling, and probably a whole lot easier to organize for the average symphony orchestra that wants to put this on. I think the main thing is that the orchestra doesn't have to source a contrabass clarinet, and they don't have to find somebody who can play it. That, I think, is the major sticking point, as I talk about in the intro. So, starting off with the actual content of the music now, you'll notice this little character here, Hauptstimme. That's what the H means. There's also Nebenstimme. All right. Well, Hauptstimme is the foreground voice, and I mean it's not all that necessary in this particular score, and indeed in the 1909 version, Schoenberg had not yet started to use this particular symbol. So it's sort of obvious from the way the music goes, but it is a good guide to the players and the conductor to play out a little bit on whichever part that has got this H with the little pointer forwards. And of course, it ends when you see the end bracket here. It also guides us as score readers in what parts of the orchestration are up front, right? Where does Schoenberg want to direct our attention, and what other parts support? So right here, obviously, it is tenor register cellos, and they go quite high here, all the way up to a high C sharp. What's cool here is how the cellos are supported by first oboe, and notice that Schoenberg, if he's anything, he is a master of balance. He's constantly thinking about which instruments are just naturally stronger, which need a little bit of help, where should the marking be, what should the dynamic marking be in comparison to another instrument. So what he's asking here is, all pretty doable, I would say. He's putting this surge right in the middle here, and then another surge up to sforzando piano. Now, as you'll hear in many different versions, this surge is, it's kind of strange, it's on the way to being louder and louder, right? So the cellos will really push it right here, and they might back off a little bit, but not as far off as they were before, and then push again. So this sforzando is almost like fortissimo for a lot of cello sections. And that's just because the conductor is sort of gesturing to everybody to get louder here, and the cellos will really want to push into it in order to keep up. And of course, with the first oboe coming in here, you'll just hear the coloration of that line, right? So here we're already getting into some very cool orchestration approaches and colors. Sort of as a bit of contrary motion here, we've got the clarinets basically going the opposite direction in these descending fifths. And under it all, we've got unison triple bassoons here, first and second plus contra, playing exactly the same pitches, and then they split apart right here when the contra gets lower than the bassoons can play. And so it just turns into an octave there and kind of gives the illusion that the bassoons have gone a couple more steps down alongside the contra. But if it's done correctly, the bassoon should not obtrude into the texture too far, right? And these are all things that probably take a lot of time to work out in rehearsal, unless the players studied this at conservatories, which I would say in Central Europe, Western Europe would be a given. Right here we go to this combined trill, right? So Hauptstimme, once again, right? We've got the combined trill here of clarinets and A2 flutes. So the flutes are just coloring the clarinet trill. And notice how Schoenberg is a realist here, right? I don't have to tell him, hey man, flutes are too soft in their bottom octave to compete with a big texture like this. He knows, right? I'm sorry, I'm just sort of thinking of one of the standard gripes or pieces of advice that I will pass along during one of my orchestration challenges is counting on the flute to be louder than it is. But here, A2, forte, is balancing with piano clarinets, according to Schoenberg's particular way of thinking. And that would have been true back then. Maybe flutes might be able to play it a little bit louder. But they won't dominate, right? Because it's the clarinet sound that should dominate here. And the reason for that is that this little line here is arcing downwards to connect with this lovely third horn muted solo. And one of the cool things about Hauptstimme is that you don't have to write solo over an instrument, right? It's a featured line, just becomes something that is the foreground of the texture. So the player is going to know that it's kind of a solo and it's kind of a featured line. It's kind of halfway in between those two ideas. But the end result is the same, and that is the player sticks right out of the texture or is completely unaccompanied, which just sounds so funny. This low note with a mute on it just has the most sinister and yet sort of shattered sound. So just a word about this texture right in here underneath the flute and clarinet trill. I have to say I just really love the way that some of this material, these the gesture and the flow of the ideas is developed as the music goes by. So we once again see this kind of downward gesture in the clarinets, and then we're going to see this come back. This whole back and forth staccatissimo. And then I just really love, once again, contrary motion to the second clarinet. These triplets going up in the first horn, which is not muted, by the way. And we get a little bit of a preliminary dive right here from the first horn. And then the clarinet just really takes us to that third horn right there. It's just really fun. It's genius level stuff. And I think it's a shame that people write off Schoenberg if they're not familiar with music that isn't strictly tonal. And, I mean, I feel that this music actually sort of skates on the edge of what is tonal and what isn't, right? I mean, you could, to a certain extent, I feel that there's a certain, I'm not going to say fussiness, but there is a strict observance of trying not to guide the ear towards any particular tonal center. And that can be really off-putting to people who feel that there's a sort of a comfort and, and familiarity in music when they have that tonal center. And I'm totally not criticizing them if that is where they are at, right? It's such a strong convention that it really is a part of a lot of musicians' identity. So they can see this music as an attack, and Schoenberg saw it as an attack too, right? I mean, he is extremely uncharitable to a lot of other composers of the day, right? The things that he said about Ravel are, they're not very gentlemanly, and yet that doesn't mean that his work should be disregarded, and nor because it is unfamiliar. There is music like this in many scores that people who are more into, like, say, epic film scores will probably absorb and not even notice, right? That the composer is quoting Schoenberg or going in this particular direction, just because the context happens to be that of suspense or horror or some other kind of thing where the audience is supposed to be unsettled, right? The double basses come back, and one thing you can say about Schoenberg is that he is really generous to his double basses. They get a lot of Hauptstimme time, right? I was going to say solo time, but really it's not a solo, it is a foreground element. So they really play out here, and what is so beautiful right in this passage is they are going to town and they are just really pushing here. This isn't intended to be getting soft and then getting softer than that. The players will come back here and hit this A flat, nice and strong. And that is because the bassoons are going to come in here, push into this phrase, and then come back out. And notice what that does to the color when you hear it. Is that you'll see the sound of the double basses sort of flare and get this beautiful rosy color. And tracking an octave below by the contras, that just opens up another color as well as the overtones push at that same line. It's just such a great idea. I mean, credit to Schoenberg for finding a way of working on this idea that is so isolated that you just hear it and you can just focus on that one idea without having to sort of pick it out amongst the rest of the texture. And this is another great gesture right in here. This time we see the Hauptstimme going to pizzicato first violins, and they have a real strength in here of just being able to kind of push this leaping pizzicato, and that is teaming up with the piccolo, which is hitting the same pitch an octave higher, right? So once again, overtones, right? You really feel like this is unified, this A flat / G sharp, B flat / A sharp. When you put them together with that force, right? Staccato here, hard pizzicato here, just a real, really pushing that pizzicato, then it just really feels unified. And I really love these introducing oboe tones, right? We have that minor third in there, and then the pizzicato plays off of it each time. And then the final one right here is the most ingenious of all, I feel. You've got those oboe thirds, and then right underneath them, these bassoon thirds are given the attack of pizzicato. And the same thing with this E flat here in the third trombone. It gives a push to that note that it wouldn't normally have. And our final Hauptstimme line for this particular page is this lovely solo right here. And I'm just going to call it a solo. And it is just almost sarcastic. It's like, oh, well, you don't like me? Well, analyze this. Right? I think that there's a lot of humor in this, as well as a certain emotional ambiguity, right? Some people might have laughed charitably alongside Schoenberg hearing this. Some might have been just shattered, right? Premonitions of what? Well, it was 1909, and like I mentioned in the intro, Europe was an armed camp. There was just a sense that war was going to eventually happen. And people lived with that for an entire generation. So you cannot fault the expressionists for not being happy about everything. So anyhow, continuing on, this muted third trombone, which is another thing that's cool, that Schoenberg's trombonists all have fun things to do, has this just lovely kind of coughing solo. And even though there is a diminuendo right here, it doesn't have to be down to piano, right? It can be just taking the edge off slightly and then punching this note. Might be as loud as forte, and then just a real solid tenuto on this last note takes us to how this line underlines the next group of gestures. Let's have a listen to all of this and think about all of those things. The contrary motion here in the clarinets, and the way that coloration from the winds creeps into these string lines here and there, of how the flutes color the clarinets without getting too strong, about the wonderful sense of contrary motion here and there. Listen for this A2 bassoon staccatissimo line, and also just the really fun low muted brass that we see from time to time. Like I was just mentioning, that third trombone, Hauptstimme, ends right here on this punchy forte piano low A natural. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't this kind of more of a bass trombone kind of a part? Well, if you're familiar with trombone playing, for a pro trombonist, that low A is no big deal at all. It's a fundamental of the second position. So it's just really easy to grab. When you get a little bit too low on your fundamentals, they kind of become ridiculous. And if that even weren't enough, there is also the F trigger and so on, like of the more modern tenor slash bass trombones that are pretty standard now for the average trombonist. So that note is pretty easy to grab. And what's nice here is that there is just a bit of an accent here. Like we've got the accented contrabassoon, which is playing the same note, because remember that our contrabassoons are transposing their part just like the double bass, right? So everything is hitting on that low A. A bit of harp, which I don't think is going to make any difference whatsoever. It's going to add a tiny bit of push, but it really won't be heard on its own. Against a forte piano accent on trombone, it's pretty much not even going to exist. Double bass is just going to add a little bit of oomph to this accent. And then, of course, contrabassoon. So, once again, we see the obsession with balance. A piano third trombone player down there is going to balance with a forte contrabassoon and have just about the same general sound, so they can blend in a way. And here we've got a development of that opening theme. We're back to the cellos, muted, playing in their tenor register, just developing that same exact first theme. And just as before, we have a wind instrument coming in here, in this case, first flute, playing unison doubling, and it gives just a beautiful sound. Notice the really, really exaggerated crescendo here. He really wants forte in the middle so that the first flute can compete with the intense chesty sound of higher cellos, right? So that comes in and even gets a little bit of help from the oboe, but he really wants this to be about flute blending with tenor register cellos, and it works really beautifully. And then here we've got another really great blend if the players are sensitive and control it. And that is flute, really, really projecting as much as it possibly can. Low flute playing really loudly. I mean, this could have also been marked Hauptstimme right here. Alongside softer English horn, right? And then this is B flat trumpet, right? So this is the same pitches as well. Triple P. Schoenberg is really building these linear textures just so beautifully and so carefully. This is really the kind of orchestration that you also see in the Rite of Spring, where there is just real obsession about the exact blending of these colors, and it works beautifully. It's just such a gorgeous sound, these three notes, and it's almost like a throwaway, right? And that's also a bit tragic, because I would really want my listeners to focus on it a little bit more, but Schoenberg doesn't have time. He just wants to get on to the next thing. Of course, as I jumped ahead here in describing the way the line went, I skipped a lot of stuff. And, partially is that the first trumpet is given a soft line. Notice the reverse dynamics here. He wants the trumpet sound to come out of the muted cellos here, right? So the trumpet quality is going to emerge, right? And the cello quality is going to submerge a little bit. Not very much. You wouldn't want it to be too trumpety right in here. But, say piano crescendo, and then this to be piano, but the mass of cellos gives it still a merged quality right in here. And over that, we hear our muted low horns, second and fourth there, and this is exactly how you would notate it, right? People are really worried about giving too much information on the page when they are not used to scoring horns. So they'll say, well, shouldn't I put this on one line with second and fourth and just save the conductor looking at it? And it's like, no, no, no. Go ahead and score it like this, right? Where you can see the second, you can see the fourth. And that is just the way that concert scoring works and is easier on the eye and much more recognizable instantly to the score reader, right? And there is no vertical compression problem here, right? That's, generally speaking, you would double up the first and third, second and fourth in gestures like this when you were really thinking about, wow, there are just so many lines on this page, there are 36 staves. That's not an issue here, right? Okay. But I really do love this heroic gesture. It's, it's worthy of Richard Strauss. And Richard Strauss at this time was quite interested in Schoenberg. And he sort of lost patience with him over the following decade. But I believe at this time he was intrigued. This is nice, just a little bit of a push right in here. This little harmony right underneath the cellos plus flutes. And there's another dash of it right in here. Now we get some real interesting stuff in here. Hauptstimme, first clarinet plus oboe. Once again, you really have to look for our transposing instruments to see what a unison is. In this case, A clarinets. That A, written A, is the same as F sharp for the C instruments. In this case, oboe. And this is really a lovely mixture of oboe and clarinet, which they kind of tell you not to do in orchestration manuals or to avoid. And I think it works great. They both should be playing fortissimo. There is a dynamic that got left off here, but I'm certain that Schoenberg would have marked this forte or even fortissimo along with the oboe. What's really great here is the way this pushes right into the strong area for both instruments. In this case, the oboe going down to its very low, loud notes, this low B trill. The first oboe player probably loved that or hated it for the premiere. Because down there, you just really have to control. You have to be careful not to squawk. And of course, that's a piece of cake for the clarinet player. So their trill can cover the oboist if the oboe part gets too honky. But just cascading down here, and then having the clarinet supply a little bit of bass here to this kind of snickering by the first trumpet, and then the low brass coming in to this harmony right here. So let's discuss this harmony. Essentially, we've got a D major seventh chord, right? D, A, C sharp, with none of these instruments being transposing. And this looks kind of strange, but he's just saying harmonic context here is a D flat compared to what's going on in the clarinet. But compared to everybody else, it's a C sharp. So he just throws that in. It is very, very low, and it is being played by muted trombones. So that gives it an interesting, eerie resonance that doesn't make it sound happy, right? And then on top of that, you've got the context of this B flat here, which really, if this is just the top part of a chord with B flat at the root, that makes the C sharp into a sharp 9, right? So it would be a B flat major chord sharp 9, and that just really plays with your mind about what is any kind of consonance down there, right? So it really is not supposed to be consonant. I'm going to try not to get into tonality versus atonality too much, but I do kind of have to mention what is going on harmonically from time to time, just to kind of help you figure out what he means to do here with the orchestration. but this is just hilarious, or inspired, right? There can be a certain joy and humor even in the inspiration of it, and that's what I see here. And we're seeing a development of some of those cascading gestures right in here with clarinets, doubling bassoon, which is taken over right here into this line going all the way down here to the B flat in the contrabassoon. And at this point, this D major 7th chord, or top part of a B flat major 7 sharp 9 chord, if you want to think of it that way, is pushing to this point right here. And this is essentially a fortissimo piano effect, right? It's going to feel like a bit of an accent or a staccato right here when this is cut off. And we've got the same thing happening here, forte piano, that same exact chord going on in first and second bassoon and bass clarinet, right? So this bass clarinet note here, which is written low E, is sounding low D below the bassoons. Pardon me for not mentioning that this tail end of this cascading line here is being doubled by harp and pizzicato double basses. I love the fact that they get a little Hauptstimme mark over their part. They can be so neglected as a resource for being a voice in the foreground. At this point, we see some spiccato cellos. Still muted, still in their tenor register for the most part. Just at least right at the beginning of this phrase. And notice that your bass clarinetist and bassoonists just are holding that chord and going on and on and on and on and on. And don't worry about this natural and sharp here. That is just from the beginning of a page. I tend to sort of cut and paste and match these pages up so that I can get as much as possible horizontally onto the standard aspect ratio of today's screens. So anyhow, the cellos are just digging away at this. Okay, so spiccato, it's kind of like saltando. It's a sort of a leaping bow. Kind of means the same thing, except that spiccato has a kind of a context or a suggestion of being more forceful, right? Almost like a, not staccatissimo, but almost like accented staccato leaping bow. Then right here, in the middle of the phrase, we see the clef change to bass, and so does the part, gradually wend its way downwards till we're getting down here towards the very, very bottom. So this is a good place to stop, actually. You will notice the chord building steam here as you listen to it, which we're going to do just now. So listen for that sort of eerie chord, which, is kind of funny because that is the happy disco chord, right? Is the major 7th chord. And it is very ironic to see it used in such a uncertain, desolate way right in here. Listen for this page, and just because this goes by in a flash and then is over and then I will return to be lecturing right after it, doesn't mean that you have to just keep going with me. You can just rewind, right? Or you can just jump back to the beginning of the music starting and look for and listen for all the different things that we've been talking about, right? What is going on with the Hauptstimme, the cellos, plus a bit of clarinets, and then, which I didn't mention before, plus some flutes right in here, and then how this kind of cascades down here with the flute in front, and then English horn and triple P muted trumpet behind, right? All of those beautiful colors, and of course the kind of heroic low horns here getting their chance to shine for once. And this oboe plus clarinet trill, and then cascading downwards to a very low trill for the first oboe, with this little punch behind. Sorry, I didn't mention this either. These horns just really barking, kind of arf, right in here. And then, of course, low muted trumpet, kind of snickering, kind of nastily here. And then this flutter tonguing of the trombones, all leading up to this kind of jolt right in here. It's kind of neat to have a dovetailing that jolts, that isn't smooth, right? Of one element giving way to another element. But psychologically, they might be dovetailing, but physically, they are kind of making it into a very, very obvious changeover. Yeah, and then also this wonderful diving line here, starting in clarinets and bassoon, and then just going all the way down here to the pizzicato double basses and contrabassoon, which is just lovely. The accented contrabassoon plus pizzicato double basses. It's just a wonderfully deliberate sound. So listen for all of those very cool effects and ideas and gestures and explorations. And I will see you in a couple of screens. Let's take on at least one more screen, even though this part right here really leads into what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. It's still kind of cool to give you a bit of a taste of that now. We see the whole spiccato thing continuing on here with the cellos, very strong, and then cooling off here, adding more voices as we go. Violas and so on, and the same elements are continuing on as well from the previous screen. Very, very low bass clarinet and bassoons all conspiring together on that same, perhaps it's a D major 7th chord, omit 3. Anyhow, so both of those elements are going to keep going, but everything else is going to replay the first screen now, right? That pretty much works the same. And we see the same contrary motion here that was in the clarinets before is now in the horns. These kind of reversing parallel fifths. And this is really a cool mixture of A2 oboes and clarinets. And it just gives them a bit of a texture here. You can see some of the influence on Holst already, just really massing the instruments as they double each other. Here we've got Fortissimo Clarinets with the coloring quality here of the oboes. So the oboes will definitely be heard. That is a strong register for them. But it's still the clarinet voice that he wants in the foreground here, even though they both are marked Hauptstimme. And then there's this just wonderful punch in the face right here. Notice these are piccolos and flutes at octaves with one another. And then, of course, the oboes and the clarinets playing the same tones here as well. This will sound as a C-sharp perfect fourth, just as it is in the oboes. Okay, and that same exact tone is being played by first and second trumpets, right? Catching that like fortissimo and then backing off. Of course, they're all muted. And same thing is happening here in the first and second horn. Right here, just very strong push right in there. Then, do you remember that bum-ba-dink kind of thing happening between the oboes and pizzicato first and second violins? And actually here, it's first violins divisi. So we've got that same kind of thing happening, slightly different pitches the second time. And behind that, this sort of punchy, muted trumpet thing happening, which is not all that big in the texture with the recording that I'm going to be playing for you in a second. Here, that descending line, once again, we've got second flute, just like before, and English horn behind that. But here we've got third horn. And this is probably just a bit of compromising on the part of Schoenberg, because there isn't another trumpet to just do the same thing again, right? And he's got them tied up, doing a different gesture. And it also gives a different tone quality, too. So, softer third horn, which he does not bring down to triple P. He just has it marked as P, right? So you get the wonderful blend of muted horn plus English horn, which are both backing up and blending with the second flute. And that is very tricky, delicate kind of doubling right in there. But really, the big stars right here are the people who are taking care of all of this tweedling up here. And here is where you'll hear a John Williams borrowing, something that he uses all the time. And that is with piccolo parts that are harmonically intriguing and flutter about way above and are almost more percussive effects than they are thematic effects. And you will completely hear it, what I'm talking about, when we play the music to this particular section. It is sort of a punchy, shrieking kind of a sound. And notice that at first we've got just the same kind of parallel doubling as before, parallel octaves. And then at this point, I think this is just a lovely idea. The second flute lets go and gets ready for its little solo right in here. And the E-flat clarinet comes in here. Now, remember that the transposition for E-flat clarinet is written down a minor third from the intended notes, right? So if this is intended to be a D-flat, writing it as A-sharp is the enharmonic equivalent of that, plus transposition. So that is really a lovely quality right in here. And the brisker, pointier overtones really make the piccolos sound very shrieky. And I am certain that I've heard bits and pieces of this particular idea in John Williams, especially in his Force Awakens soundtrack. There's a big spaceship battle where they are attacking the reactor or something like that on a Starkiller base or something like that. Anyways, not too clear on the exact details, but this is something that Williams does, which I also mentioned in the intro, is that he uses Schoenberg a lot in his action scenes. And this is just one particular shrieking quality of the piccolos, which are actually not even playing that loudly, right? They're playing piano, but they're so bright that Schoenberg is trying to keep them from taking over the entire sound picture, not too successfully, especially putting in giving them the encouragement here of a bit of a crescendo in the middle of this. They are really going to stand out, especially going all the way up there to their high C. That is just going to be like a kettle whistling, right? So add the very pointy overtones coming from the piccolo clarinet, and you just really have a percussive effect up there, kind of like the overtones of a bell or some other kind of thing that just really hits your ear in a hard way. And that is the kind of orchestration that was pretty much unheard of in that way. You know, of course there were piccolo lines from Tchaikovsky and other prominent orchestrators from the generation before, but not with this effect isolated for its own sake, and then opening the door on the kinds of effects that we hear in film music today. So think about all those things. I just wanted to bring a lot of that stuff up before we dived into the second of 3 lectures on this first movement of Arnold Schoenberg's 5 pieces for orchestra. Have a listen now, and I will see you in the next lecture.